This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
A little self-care can go a long way, especially amidst the hustle and bustle of the holidays. That's where Vegamore comes in. Trusted by millions, Vegamore is all about giving your hair the love and care it deserves. With their vegan and cruelty-free formulas, you can nourish and revitalize your strands while indulging in some much-needed pampering. Because let's face it, who couldn't use a bit more me time this time of year? Go to vegamore.com/ACAST, code ACAST. That's vegamor.com/ACAST, code ACAST.
It took a lifetime to find the person you want to marry. Finding the perfect engagement ring is a lot easier. At BlueNile.com, you can find or design the ring you've always dreamed of with help from Blue Nile's jewelry experts who are on hand 24/7 to answer questions, and the ease and convenience of shopping online. For a limited time, get $50 off your purchase of $500 or more with code LISTEN at BlueNile.com. That's $50 off with code LISTEN at BlueNile.com.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody, my name's John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Ian Nathan. Anybody who's interested in film books will know Ian Nathan's work, because he's written a whole bunch of them, from Quentin Tarantino to Wes Anderson, Ridley Scott to the Coppolas. He's a fantastic read, and his books are always incredibly incisive. Today we're going to be mostly talking about Ridley Scott, but he's got so many books and so many ideas that the conversation bounces around a fair bit, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Remember, if you do enjoy listening to the episode, to like, subscribe, and spread the word as far and wide as is possible. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation.
I suppose my path is somewhat more obvious in some ways. So I came out of university and was desperate to become a film journalist. I had no idea how to do it, and sort of figured out a way. People often ask, how'd you get into film journalism? And I go, I don't quite remember, but you just sort of, you bluff your way in, to be honest. I looked at film magazines and magazines that were just beginning. This is the early 90s, and made a savvy choice of thinking new magazines are more likely to want new writers than established magazines. And I got involved in a magazine called Vox, which was more music than it was film, but I got involved in the film department, and it was part of I don't know if you remember it, but it's part of the NME Sounds. It was sort of a monthly version of those magazines.
Sure.
And to cut a very long story short, a job came up at Empire while I was sort of just freelancing, getting established. It was just a staff writer job, and I went for it and got it. You'd have to ask them why they picked me out of all the people at the time. Again, I think it was a lot of bluff on my behalf. I interviewed quite well and began this incredible journey on Empire. I edited it. I was executive editor. I was there for 20 years. It was just fantastic. I got to do incredible things, and it was really hard work, daunting, and it pissed you off all the time, and you fought battles. So it was just like the full cornucopia of life in publishing. And it was always at the back of my head, almost like a bit of a dream, would this move on to books at some point? Would there be a sort of transition from being a journalist and loving it, but you think long term, there's got to be some other part of it. Part of it was a bit of ego, I think. I just wanted to have a book on a shelf.
Going to the bookshop and
yeah, the thing I still do all the time, and go straight for the film shelves and look for my own thing, and then panic if I'm not there, and panic if I'm there.
Do you shuffle them a little bit? Do you sort of put yours out front and move other competing titles to the back?
Just a little bit. And you get that just occasionally you get that really bizarre moment where you walk in and somebody's holding your book and looking at it, and you're trying not to stare at them. You're trying to mind read what's going on in their heads as they look at your book. You want to step over and go, "That's me," but you know that would you'd be a lunatic if you did that. And so I have resisted that temptation.
There's a Jonathan Coe novel. I think it might be What a Carve Up, where a writer is on a train and a girl is reading his novel, and he can't resist saying, "Okay, well, where are you?" And I wrote that, and it turns out, I think, spoiler for Jonathan Coe novel, it turns out that she's entrapping him essentially, and like that was the worm on the hook. Nobody reads your book. Why would anyone read your book?
I have got a similar memory to that. I was traveling home on a train one night, and a new issue of Empire was out, and I saw the guy in front of me was reading the new issue of Empire, and I saw he was reading my review of Heat. So he wasn't just reading Empire, he was reading my review. And I didn't sort of stop and go, "That's me," because again, that is a lunatic thing to do. But it was kind of intriguing because you just want to know what they're thinking. They're just thinking, "What is Heat any good?" That's all he's thinking. I fancy that. De Niro and Pacino, this sounds great. That's all that's going through his head. But in my head, it's like, I like the turn of phrase. That's a very witty way of putting that. What an insightful thought. That's all going through my head. He's just going, "Oh, 5 stars, Heat. I may actually this Friday night, that'll be my choice," or something on those lines. But it's a kind of weird experience. Anyway, obviously I spent a lot of time at Empire, and for whatever level, I gained something of reputation. And the film books sort of came along while I was still there. And Aurum, who published, and I still get published with, who do a kind of really a nice line in film books in the sense that they're not a specific film publisher, but they're into it enough to be detailed and not academic, but historical, but also commercial enough to know you've got to sell these things to a wide audience. It was quite a good publisher to be with. But they came to me and said, "We got an idea of writing a book about Alien. We've got the American side of our company who has gained access to the Fox archives and through a financial deal, basically."
Right.
And we want someone who knows about Alien. And I always was the kind of go-to guy on Empire for Ridley and Alien. And I kind of stamped out that territory for myself, mainly because I was such an enthusiast. And the first 2 films especially, but I'd sort of covered number 3 and I've covered number 4, and I'd sort of stuck with it. And I didn't. You go through the rigmarole. They came and I said, "Look, I want to do this," to the publisher, and I said, "Okay, put a proposal in," and so you had to do your chapter guide, the deal, and write a potential, just a sample chapter. That seemed to go pretty easily. I think they had an idea that from their side, someone from Empire writing this book was a good thing, because Empire would then cover the book, and you get there's bonuses from the publisher's side of it, and that became Alien Vault, which was a terrific adventure. It was a real kind of learning curve in the sense of, on Empire, you write 2,000, 3,000 words tops. And suddenly I was doing a 35,000 word book over about, 5 months, I think it was. And you sort of relearn your trade in a way. You have to slow down and speed up at the same time. You have to go right into micro detail. But then there's this kind of thing, I'm sure all the writers you've kind of interviewed have said this, that there's a point where you have to kind of stop, because there's this kind of black hole of detail you can fall down into and never stop. You just keep thinking, well, I've got to explain that, and I've got to explain that. How much have I got to tell of the history of Ian Holm? Have I got to go right back into his early career and explain how he ended up as Ash? And you have to go stop, and because the publisher's going, we can't fit this in. So you learned restraint as well as depth. You learn the kind of the different things you have to do. And as far as I know, I never got the full publishing figures on Alien Vault. It was a good, big success, and I think continues to be. We did a new edition a couple of years ago with the anniversary, and that got the ball rolling. It's like a biblical thing. One book begats the next book, and you start. But for the first few years, I was still at Empire, so I did Alien Vault and Terminator Vault while I was still at Empire. But I had that by that point thinking, well, this Empire thing is going to come to an end. I'm getting too long in the tooth, and they want to do different things. And the arguments within the company, the publishing company, about digital media and all these things were going on were just driving me insane. So I thought books, the oldest of old media, might be the route for me. And that turned out to be the case. And I'm very grateful for that. And I'm very grateful for Empire, really, to giving me the tools to do it and giving me the kind of platform. to launch into that side of it.
And I imagine access was also a part of that you must have sort of gained a network of contacts just via the day job, so to speak.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I have Ridley's home phone number. That would be an exaggeration. But yes, certainly if you put in your request note, you send through and say, I am blah, 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 Empire Magazine, this is my background. That really helps you over the first few hurdles. They'll listen to you. I mean, like everything in this world, I've produced award ceremonies, I've written books, and I've worked for Empire at high level and all these things. It's still a battle. Whatever it is, it's still a battle to get the thing you want. But yes, you're right. It was help. It really helped. That's sort of my credentials.
What was it like going into those archives then? What was it? I mean, I was talking to Paul Cronin, and he was telling me that like he actually prefers going into. He gets the same feeling of discovery going into an archive that I get going to a film festival and seeing a roster of a program of new films from fresh perspectives.
I think it really helps if you love the films and the universe of the films. Sometimes it can become a bit academic. When I've done full director stories, inevitably you like some films more than others in their career. So it's great, on Coppola, it's great when you're doing Apocalypse Now. It's just fascinating. But when you come to Peggy Sue Got Married, and I actually quite like Peggy Sue Got Married, but
I can think of worst couple of films. Jack.
Jack, the Nadia one everyone brings up. You kind of like have to. And in some ways, it's quite interesting because you're looking for a route into Jack to explain it. So it becomes a bit more academic. But you're absolutely right. There's something wonderful about seeing the paperwork and seeing the old pictures. In some ways, the old pictures are great, but they're kind of a bit more, they're going to illustrate the book, and that's fine. I just love seeing call sheets. I did the book about Lord of the Rings, and a lot of that came through my contacts through Empire and my relationship with Peter Jackson. And that was all fantastic. And I went out to New Zealand many times, and he was brilliant. He said, well, look, here's my archive. And they've got it all digitized. It's all very modern there. And he gave me access to every single call sheet, of this enormous production. And they were just wonderful documents and really informative, day 78, wherever the location was. There was, you got the kind of the props required and what was being shot, scene 33C, Frodo does this to Sam and whatever it is. But then you can read down, there's always notes at the bottom from the producer. Please, if you have a parking space, do not occupy anybody else's parking space. Who left their Wellington boots on set last week? And when they come and claim them from the office, these lovely kind of rehumanizing notes that bring the whole thing down to a rather sort of humble but rather beautiful level. And you get those in every film. Alien, there's these kind of notes about people turning up on time and sort of obeying things. And then there's, doing Terminator, there's these wonderful handwritten Cameron notes we looked at, and they were just sort of, he puts everything down. He's got this very amazing mind where he just has to, get everything on paper and his ideas because there's so many. It's just the casting ideas written in sort of his own handwriting. Bruce Springsteen for Kyle Reese, and Sting. They think they're kind of
Bruce Springsteen.
They looked for Bruce Springsteen for Kyle Reese while it was still O.J. Simpson to play the Terminator, which was a Hendale. Because you look at the timings, O.J. Simpson was huge at 1982 when they were putting the film together. And there's been this Hertz advert that was the biggest thing on American TV, in which he runs through an airport, leaps over it. And he was suddenly about to become a movie star. Of course, subsequent history tells you he's very different, but he was, number one choice. And they were going through all these ideas for Kyle Reese to be a counter to O.J. Simpson. So they had Christopher Reeve was a really number one choice, but he was too expensive.
Right.
He was one of the biggest stars of the time. And and eventually it all comes down and someone, this is all covered a bit of myth, but someone somewhere suggests Schwarzenegger as Kyle Reese. As the story goes, and Cameron's just not having any of it. He's just like, I'm not having Conan the Barbarian in my film. This is absurd. And they have this famous lunch, and Cameron sits there and looks at him, and of course Schwarzenegger just starts talking about the Terminator. He's read the script, very disciplined. Schwarzenegger. He just starts going, well, if you're going to do the Terminator, he's got to be able to fire without blinking. He's got to be able to assemble the rifle without looking at all these kind of things. Cameron's just sitting there looking at it, sketching something on a napkin. And just goes, no, you've got to play the Terminator. Schwarzenegger's like, aren't I meant to be the hero guy? And all those other ideas sort of get thrown out the window as soon as Schwarzenegger becomes the deal. At that point, they can't afford anyone, so they have to go for Michael Biehn and Linda Hamilton and all their other ideas. Like Rosanna Arquette was very close to being Sarah Connor. The point was these lovely sort of almost like diary entries from Cameron you can see his thought process and Hemdale's thought process.
It's almost like you're looking into his mind. It's almost like you're seeing a movie being thought into existence.
Yeah, you are, and also again, it's quite humble or humbling. You see big things, that are technically very difficult, just being sketched out in handwriting. The order of sequences in an edit suite. There's just some guy on a foolscap, with writing in pen.
It's like the Beatles doing a song list on the back of an envelope for a gig, for the rooftop gig in Abbey Road. It's like, okay, we'll start with, we're not doing Octopus Garden, Ringo. Shut up.
It's great, and it also, as I say, it humanizes it a bit. And you think actually these guys, they're trying to figure it out. And they're figuring it out in the way we all do. They're just writing on a notepad and sort of going through things. And from there, obviously, they expand to these famous films. But that I love.
When we receive these movies, we receive them as sort of fait accompli. They're done. And you have this almost in your head, this sort of, it's like a cognitive illusion that it could not have been any other way. This was inevitable. That of course, who else is Terminator except Arnold Schwarzenegger? So when you look back and you see how conditional and how there are these alternative universes with Bruce Springsteen and Christopher Reeve and O.J. Simpson and,
I love that stuff. I'm kind of obsessed with kind of alternative views. I was reading Stephen Back's book on Marlene Dietrich, and it's a wonderful, really detailed book. And then it comes across at one point where she contemplated playing Mary Poppins. But long before Julie Andrews, it came across her path that Marlene Dietrich could have been Mary Poppins, because they were big books.
Yeah.
And she didn't think it was her, or the agent didn't think it was her. It got passed on. But I thought, there's this universe somewhere where Marlene Dietrich is Mary Poppins, and what would that be like? She'd be quite scary, I think. And there's this guy, in Blade Runner, Scorsese looked at that book long before Ridley did it. So there's a universe where Martin Scorsese makes a version of Blade Runner. It wouldn't be called Blade Runner, but I love those little sort of path, timeline sort of switches, forks in the path that could have given you a different film entirely.
Scorsese has never done a science fiction film, has he? I'm just trying to think, but I don't think he's ever done as a genre. He's never touched on it. So even that would be weird, just that he would, a little bit like Ridley Scott, sort of introduce himself to the world as a genre filmmaker rather than a more sort of poetry of the streets, autobiographical, New York-based filmmaker.
Yeah, and you can imagine Scorsese would have made it like Mean Streets. You can imagine it be very much like a New York noir, which in many ways Blade Runner is like. Maybe there wouldn't be that much difference, but it's interesting. He did look at that, thought about it, but again, early on in his career, so maybe he hadn't quite established what the Scorsese mood was going to be for the rest of his time. He's just interested in the book.
That would have been sort of a boxcar Bertha period. So it could have been a Corman-esque science fiction rather than as if he did it now, and it would be $250 million and everyone would be de-aged and it'll be all sorts of bells and whistles. But interesting in the relationship with Ridley Scott as well, not in terms of necessarily your personal relationship, but the relationship in terms of the films. You said you sort of carved out a piece of a corner of expertise at Empire with Ridley Scott. Was that one of your earliest sort of name directors that you admired, or how did you get into him?
Yeah, he was. My relationship with Ridley Scott actually starts with Alien, and starts when I was quite young, and my mum going off to see Alien, which I knew was a science fiction film. And I, like kids of that age, I'd seen Star Wars, and I just want every science fiction belonged to me. And it was just ridiculous to me that my mother could go and see a science fiction film and I couldn't because I was too young. So I was really infuriated by that. And I remember it very clearly. I remember the next day, and then I'd say, well, what was it like? And she told me it was so good, it was hysterical. And the audience were reacting hysterically. And I was very confused by that idea. I thought, why is it funny? She didn't mean funny. She meant hysteria. She had these films, and she didn't really want to explain to me quite why. Put these images in my head, I understand. But that has stuck with me so strongly. And when the time you get to, I don't know, when I saw it on VHS, for the first time, probably bunking off school one afternoon or something. I think we watched The Thing and Alien one of the most important afternoons of my life, really. I totally kind of got what she was saying. And I remember liking Alien more than I liked The Thing, even though I loved The Thing, don't get me wrong. It was the atmosphere. I loved the ingredients, of course, and the tension, but I adored the way it felt and looked very deeply. And then obviously I saw Blade Runner at the cinema. but still maybe a bit young. And again, I wanted to see Han Solo in the new science fiction film with the Han Solo guy in it. And saw this sort of existential film noir that I didn't really understand, but came out haunted by it. And then I've revisited so many times, I can't count. But I began a relationship with the style that Ridley Scott had, even though I wasn't quite aware of that relationship yet. And Ridley Scott talked about the fact that when he saw Citizen Kane, that was the first time he became aware a director was at work, that choices were being made, that the scene looked the way it did and felt the way it did, more importantly, because someone has come into this with an idea, where you put your cameras and how it looks, and you've got a team involved to bring that off. And I think that's what I thought or was experiencing with the early Ridley Scott film, that someone was making this like it was for a reason, even though I wasn't quite sure what reason that was at first. But I'm not 100% sure what reason to this day what. But, that's the joy of Blade Runner, is you can't quite fix what Ridley Scott was intending to do. It's got this elusive quality about it. And I think that, if anything, sets me on the path of my whole career, in a way, trying to interpret those things and put them down on page.
I feel I have a very similar... I was talking to Christina Briello-Jerling yesterday. We were having a conversation about on a podcast, and I sort of admitted to her that if somebody asked me, who was your first sort of director, I would always say, it was Orson Welles or it was Kubrick or someone like that. But really, it was Ridley Scott. It was really, It was my image of him as a director when we were kids and we were very into films and we wanted to it was always things like running down corridors. That was the sort of like a key visual element. It was strobing lights and corridors and that's all. It's Alien and Blade Runner. Those films sort of impressed on me that sort of visual language. So weirdly, for me, Ridley Scott it's similar to you. It's that guy who I suddenly realized, oh, that's a director. How did you feel sort of watching his career develop? Because after those two Citizen Kanes of science fiction, the only way was down, really. But
I suppose so. I mean,
down and up and down and up and down and up.
It was kind of like that. And maybe he hasn't reach those particular heights again. Although, he would look at things very differently, and he's not a guy who looks back, particularly Ridley. He's not a guy for regrets. He likes the films in the past, but he's very much keep going. I mean, he's 83 now and he's got 2 films coming out, and it's phenomenal in terms of his productivity. It was weird. You get into a little bit, and certainly when you're young and into films, where it's almost a bit like supporting a football team, that you're a Ridley guy and you're on Ridley's team, and in some ways you overlook things and you're forever borne along by hope. I like Legend. It's a flawed film and a very troubled film in terms of its production. But visually, I think year by year, you look at it and think, actually, that's sumptuous. That in terms of, he wasn't using CGI or any of these tools. And the physicality of that world is marvelous. It's a fairy tale. And it's not a fantasy film. It's a fairy tale. He's very clear about that. And I've always, there's a phrase in Empire that, you'd go to away games for certain directors. That was your, I'd go away games for Ridley. I'm committed. I've struggled with certain films and I've loved others. I love 1492. You were tweeting about it the other day, and I have a great love of 1492. I think it's one of his most beautiful films. I know it's narratively, certainly by the third act, it feels jagged and things aren't quite organized properly. And he would say there is a longer version of it that is much more coherent, but probably was unreleasable at that length. But I just think the texture of that film is astonishing. And the idea of the chaos of history, rather than some kind of moral stance on history, it is this is good and this is bad. History's a kind of mess that just kind of unfolds and spills over with these pioneers getting things right and getting things wrong and all the things that came with colonialism. And he did bring dark times to the world in many ways, Columbus, but he also shaped the way the modern world is and was an extraordinary character. And I love the fact that Ridley Scott is obsessed with that. And so I've always enjoyed his historical epics. I think no one has brought the past to life as well as Ridley Scott on the screen. You can argue the merits of individual stories and plots and narratives, Kingdom of Heaven, certainly the theatrical cut gets a bit caught up, and I'm not sure Orlando Bloom is the best piece of casting. But in terms of, I think it's a voice thing with him. I always say, he's got a bit of what I call a sixth form voice. It sounds a bit like a school prefect. It's something I've talked about in the past, is that I think voices are so important to film. And people don't think about them very much. And great actors have to have great voices, whatever things. They can be John Candy, who was a great voice, or they can be Richard Burton, who was also an incredible voice.
Yeah. Few men even considered the possibility of life on other planets. Sorry, that's my.
I grew up on that album as well.
A boy stands in a field. I don't think Richard Burton did the ooh-lahs.
I'd love to if he did do the ooh-lahs.
That was Phil Lynott, I think.
But yeah, I think Orlando Bloom's main problem is I think he's just got this voice that never convinces you. Arise the night and all that. You think this is the big moment. And
yeah, that's a really, really good point. I think you've absolutely put your finger on it there, because he is. I watch Kingdom of Heaven with a sense of almost traumatic loss, but because it's everything around him is so good, and I'm just thinking, God, you could put almost any of the other actors in his role, and you would immediately have like a classic movie. You could put David Thewlis playing his role, or Liam Neeson. Imagine if Liam Neeson was that, if they they did some Scorsese de-aging. And
Liam Neeson's finest moment is Kingdom of Heaven. He's just magnificent. It's a small role, but he's that battle scene at the beginning when the knights are taken out. He's fabulous in his own right. Nikolai Coster-Waldau is in there, and all these fantastic people, and Orlando Bloom. But Neeson is there's a wink in that sequence when the guys they know they're surrounded, and Neeson just turns around and winks at him. It must have been an improv on set. Yeah, and it's so good. And you think, this guy feels medieval and modern at the same time. You just want to see his story. I just wanted a Dirty Dozen with those knights moving through the Crusades. I was like, I'm here. This is the movie. I know he wanted to tell this kind of historical thing about progress and West and East, which is his big subject, really. But Neeson just fabulous in that film.
I'm gonna come back to Legend in a second, but I also want to sort of pause a second on 1492, because I do think it is a really underrated movie, and I agree there are problems with the length, which it actually should be a longer movie. He sort of short changes. That was one of those few movies that I went to see at the cinema, and then I went to see the same week. And it must have been the same week, because I don't think they held it over for 2 weeks. Just because I was kind of just so puzzled by it. It blew me away, but at the same time, it was this puzzling movie that I couldn't quite get a handle on. That's the other thing I would go with Ridley Scott is Blade Runner introduced me to Philip K. Dick, and it introduced me to Vangelis. And sort of 1492 brings Vangelis back as well. So there's just this sort of real wealth. One other thing, and this is one of those annoying, more a comment than a question sort of interventions. But I think that 1492 gives us much more of an indication of what a Ridley Scott horror film would look like than Hannibal,
Yes. Yeah. Oh, that's a good. Yeah. It's a really good point. Yeah.
There's a really interesting, that first sort of where they go to the village and the stuff hanging down. It's almost like Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
That's incredible. The burning at the stake. At the beginning of the film, the child watches in the chaos, and they're all cheering on. They're sort of throttling people, and it's so vivid and so shocking. And he wants to say progress isn't all what it's stacked up to be. This is the first world in terms of 1492, and look at it. It's barbaric. Religion is barbaric. He's saying civilization is rough edged. He's saying progress is a hard thing, and it's not clean. We always look at the inspiration for history and all those things. And he's saying, no, look at it. It's mean and horrible. And
he brings up slavery. He has the city was designed by Leonardo da Vinci, but slaves built it.
Ridley Scott has mentioned that there is a 4-hour cut that exists, and HBO, I think, have it. Now, he doesn't say HBO are planning to put it on the channel at some point. He just said they have it. And he said there was a 3-hour version he really should have put out, and he was talked into cutting it because it was so, that point long. And I think it was still at that stage, we hadn't had Titanic, and we hadn't had all the Lord of the Rings films and those things that proved that long films could do very well at the box office. There was always that concern about how many showings a day and all those things. So he was talked into cutting into 1492. And I think you're right. The end suffers more than anything. It doesn't quite pan out as a story. But he says that there is this 4-hour version that probably might need tidying up. Need to go look at it, and maybe we've got enough score. But I would really love to see that. HBO put it out, or Criterion just go with like a mini series almost version of 1492, and get all the textures and maybe make more sense of the endings. You know, the new world he tries to build that collapses and all that stuff. That's very hurried in the cut that we saw. But there must be a lot more to that.
There's something so surreal about that storm, and I just have a real nostalgia for stuff that is done in camera. So, you know, this is pre-CGI, and you've got massive ships and massive crowds, and all of that stuff just feels, where you compare it to something like, I don't know, Martin Scorsese's Silence, where it has a medieval sort of bit of Japan, like a crowd scene, and it's just so obviously digital that it just takes you out of the movie, you know?
Yeah. I mean, the scene where the banks of cloud pull back and he sees land, you know, he sees the new world. And of course, they had to do that physically. They had to generate enough dry ice, huge amounts of dry ice, just to fill the beach or fill, you know, the shot of the beach. They had these giant wind machines to blow it all away. So, you know, we see onto the curtain being pulled back, and, you know, Columbus sees, you know, paradise, and that's what Ridley wanted, and they worked out how to do it. It's a fantastic shot.
I think a good point you make in the book, the retrospective, and I was rereading the book for the purposes of this podcast, and it made me go back and watch Legend, which I hadn't seen since I was, you know, 14, 15, I guess. Yeah. And that is you can almost tell the point in the film where the studio burnt down. You know, there's always a bit where you go, right, it's here. This is where, from this point on, they're trying to...
The forest disappears, doesn't it? There's no more, the Sylvian forest is all gone because it's all burned.
But I agree with you. That's a really interesting film. I mean, I would put it much more in the Company of Wolves, which I think you do as well. So I shouldn't claim that as my point. Then I don't know what was a similar sort of, I don't know, like Krull or one of those sort of more.
It was the era of the kind of Muppety fantasy films, Labyrinth and Dark Crystal. And that was the kind of the fantasy market at the time, and Krull, as you mentioned it. But I don't think Ridley ever saw that as even a comparison. You know, he'd come out of 3 films, you know, that ultimately are all kind of fairy tales: Alien, Blade Runner, and Legend. If you think about them, very, you know, haunted house, the story of fairies, really, and their brief existence, and this kind of weird fairy tale city of Blade Runner, into the literal fairy tale of Legend. You know, I think he imagined a kind of trilogy. You know, and he was hugely influenced by Jean Cocteau. And yeah, the thing with Ridley, you always fall back on, is that he went to art school, and he was taught by Francis Bacon when he turned up, Francis Bacon, that is, you know, to do his lectures. And he had a path where he could have been a professional painter. He could have gone down that, done oils, and in a way he did become a professional painter. You know, that stayed with him as he went off into film and became captivated by the moving image. He still is the professional painter, and that's what Legend is. It's beautifully painted. It's, you know, ornate, and it captures the kind of the very Freudian elements of fairy tales. The idea of sexuality, you know, the evil is just a giant phallic guy, isn't it? Really, it's the alien all over again. You know, he's. And then Scott said this. He said, "I want to see him healthy. I want this, you know, this character to be alive." You know, the physique, you know, is very male, great horns with his helmet. You know, it's not subtle, really. No. You know, he's a horny devil, and the girl is tempted. You know, that's fairy tale stuff. That's, you know, as you said, Company of Wolves. It's the puberty analogy, and Tom Cruise, you know, has to come in, and I quite like Tom Cruise in it because he's got that weird thing that Tom Cruise has in a lot of his performances, where he's just a bit like an animal. He's just weird. He seems to sniff the air. It's very odd, his mannerisms in it, and he is kind of a creature of the woods. He's not quite sort of civilized. And that's got a good role for Cruise when you think about it. That jumpiness, you know, he has.
And he's one of our most, I don't think he's one of our best actors by a long shot, but he's one of our sort of most sincere actors. You can almost feel his sincerity of he's not camp. He's not, you know, that's why Mission Impossible has such a different tone to James Bond. Is he's never winking. He's never, why does this always happen to me? He never has that. It's like, of course this happens to me. It's my job. You know, so there's this sincerity. Eyes Wide Shut has this real, you can see him trying in that film so hard that it's almost poignant. I think he thinks he's in a different film to the one he thinks he's in, you know? Yeah. Going back a little bit to your point about the painter and the art, that runs all the way through his career because, of course, when he has Gladiator, he's gifted a painting to sort of persuade him or print to persuade him. Hannibal, I think the sequences in Florence are luscious because he loves being in the capital of the Renaissance art movement. I think he is a bit undervalued because whenever people talk about Ridley Scott as being this visual artist, they always refer to the commercials rather than to the art school background. But I always feel that he's a bit like Sergio Leone. I mean, Leone used to use paintings a lot for lighting guides. You know, he'd use Goya to work out how to light a scene. And I think there's the same eye that Ridley has, really. God damn it, I keep making these comments rather than questions.
No, it's great. I mean, you're absolutely spot on. And he would agree with you and probably launch on a whole thing of the things that have stimulated him. I mean, Alien, you know, the coming of Alien, the way I think it became a film was the moment when Dan O'Bannon sits beside him and opens Necronomicon and points to Giger's painting. And Scott, that's what Scott needs. He says, I'm a visualist. And what he means is that that's an input and an output. You know, he needs visuals to come in and then they go out. He studied art history and he wanted to be a production designer when he joined the BBC. You know, he in terms of that frame is so vitally important to him. And he saw Giger's painting and he said, you know, it's a very funny story. Dan O'Bannon said, you know, I've already suggested this and Fox have gone mad and fired the guy. And Scott was going, it's this or I go, basically. He was so sure as soon as he saw it. And he flew to Zurich and found Giger and said, come back to LA. And I'm sure it got much more complicated than that, but that's kind of the crux of what happened. And that's it. I mean, that's the way Scott, I think, literally functions. As you say, with Gladiator, it was the painting that won him over. He just saw it and he goes on like that. And he's very stimulated by physical art. I think Gucci will be interesting because I think Gucci will be the film that more than any marries all the sides of Scott together. The art history, the visualist, the historian, the movie maker, in the sense of, I think it will play to a classic tradition of European thrillers, but also the world of advertising and glamour. And we should never discount, you know, Ridley Scott Associates and his advertising background, because he said there were 30 seconds of perfection or 2 minutes of perfection. That's what you built. And all of what any advert is trying to do is get someone to buy something. So it's born along on the idea of desire. You have to make these images desirable on some level to play to the audience. They will on a primal level, on a level of you need this, you want this. That's, you know, seduction is what's going on. And I think that's what he's taken into his films, that he seduces us. He makes a film about a dystopian city, you know, the ruined future. And we just want to live there. We look at it and think, this place is astonishing. We want to go there. You know, it's so beautiful and you're so haunted and touched by it. And it's a bit like his advertising. And I mean that in a positive sense. You know, he's not shallow because of that. It's a really important part, I think, his makeup.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's almost like it helps him create his craft as well, helps him sort of work out what his palette is going to be, what he can then use in a broader sense. Well, going on to sort of the later part of his career, obviously he goes back to Alien, and you'd covered the Alien sequels. Where do you sort of, with the Alien sequels, is there a point where you were sort of fed up with having to cover them because of diminishing returns? Or, I mean, I really like Alien 3, which again is one of those problematic movies which starts so well, and you know, the exit of Charles Dance is kind of the moment where it all seems to fall to pieces.
Yeah, it's again, more trouble than any troubled production. It's a nightmare. It was a nightmare in terms of getting a script to work beforehand. I think there's this sort of sense that they just began because they had to begin, and Hill and Geiler, who didn't care as much as maybe they could have done on that film, were churning this thing out and trying to get it to work, and poor old Fincher's caught in the crossfire. But I think, I presume you've watched the cut on DVD. It's the assembly cut, or what it's called, because it's not a director's cut, because Fincher won't even talk about it, let alone go back and look at it. But that's a really interesting version of Alien 3 that makes a lot more sense of it, tells the McGann story. And I love that idea that Fincher kind of wanted to do a sequel to the first film, not the second film. In a way, what Alien 3 is, it's an alternative version of Aliens. So it could have gone this way, where it's much more austere. It's almost like a Dickensian story, you know, the workplace horror. And it's got that kind of rather fantastic, sort of clammy look to it. I think Sigourney Weaver's great in it. I think after a while, it takes getting used to, but the Britishness of it comes through after a while. You go, okay. And you're right. It's just, if you watch the original version, I remember, because I was obsessed with the first two Alien films, and so I was so, you know, into Alien 3. And of course, at that point, there was no internet, and there was no kind of, you know, rumor mill or hype machine. What we got was posters and occasional things like Starlog. And we had a program, basically just a string of trailers that played late on Channel 4, I think it was, on a Friday night. Movies, something and something, or whatever it was called. And I would tape it avidly every Friday. And I remember the first time they had the Alien 3 trailer on it. And it was actually a pretty good trailer. And I said, oh, yeah. And I watched that trailer ad infinitum, so keyed up for that film. And again, it's a bit like football. I forgave it a lot just because it existed. I kind of went in and I came and I was disappointed. I was really disappointed, but I was trying to make sense of it in my head. And I was trying to go, well, yeah, what about that? But it's a film that has stuck with me and I've gone back to. And I like the assembly cut, even though it's not really complete. And I think there's a lot going on there that's really interesting. Alien Resurrection. Well, there's some nice things in it, and good ideas. And again, Weaver is fantastic. She gets what that film needs entirely. It just where it goes is just so bonkers that this kind of kills off the whole mood entirely.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous 2-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
It took a lifetime to find the person you want to marry. Finding the perfect engagement ring is a lot easier. At BlueNile.com, you can find or design the ring you've always dreamed of with help from Blue Nile's jewelry experts who are on hand 24/7 to answer questions. And the ease and convenience of shopping online. For a limited time, get $50 off your purchase of $500 or more with code LISTEN at BlueNile.com. That's $50 off with code LISTEN at BlueNile.com.
The film, that I struggled with, I think more than those, because in a way they were sort of classic sequel diminishing returns, was Prometheus. Again, it was Ridley going back to the alien universe, and there was the things he talked about, the origins of the creature, which I was nervous about because in a way I don't like prequels very much as an idea because they kill mystery. And mystery is a lovely quality. And in Alien, the beauty was you never knew where this creature came from. You just imagined it. And this spaceship and the derelict and all that. What is out there in the universe? This is incredible and savage. And you think, wow, and that's a great way to start a film. I don't want to know the origins. And I really don't want to know now I've found them out. And Prometheus, that worried me. But I was encouraged because it was Ridley and there was so much hype around there. It built up into this big thing. But that, in a way, was a bigger disappointment as a film to me than perhaps even Alien Resurrection. It was just a fumbled film to me because you can see the bones of the Alien prequel it was going to be sort of still poking through the surface. The ampules that clearly were eggs at some point in some script version. And there's a lovely cleanness to the biology of the first two films. The life cycle makes sense. You can see the real world stuff in it. And the life cycle stuff in Prometheus makes no sense to me at all. I've seen it a few times, and it's like, what's going on here? This is stuff written over stuff. And I don't understand. Ridley, he's such a certain guy in many ways, and you meet him, and he's so sure of his opinions and thoughts about film. Yet you look at certain films, and you see doubt that's come into his head about the direction. And there was a serious, doubt that came into his head with that process where he went, I can't do another Alien film. I've got to disguise this film as something else. I'll do this kind of Ersatz 2001 rather morbid thing that still is kind of an Alien film somewhere underneath the surface.
Yeah, I just couldn't get the human element of that film. I didn't think Noomi Rapace really was compelling in any way. And I think that thing of the female, the sort of the last girl, has become something of a cliche as well. And it could have been problematized. Because the idea of the original one was it's such a surprise that Sigourney Weaver's going to be the one that saves the day to some degree and survives. And I also couldn't get that. You had characters who were essentially scientists, but they, for no narrative reason, but for a sort of generic reason, they were behaving as if they were Marines or sort of the sort of space truckers of the first film, where they're, I'm a geologist, I know what I'm talking about, shut up, And it was just like, why are you behaving like this? Except for the old horror movie sort of narrative convenience thing of, I threw away the map. I didn't want doing dumb stuff to get yourself into some sort of jeopardy. I think I went on a similar journey of being extremely anticipating it with a lot of pleasure, and then watching it and thinking, oh gosh. Oh dear! Don't run in zigzags. Don't run in a straight line.
All that, all that stuff. And this is a film. Like, you actually look at it. There's no monster in it. Things sort of happen and creatures sort of turn up, but there's no real monster. It's good. The monster's dead. They've gone to a grave site and they've got to start inventing a monster out of nothing. And I think in Ridley's head, maybe it's a bit Forbidden Planet and it's a bit all those things. And he's determined to do this origin story. But that's like, clean narrative ideas. In the end, Alien is a monster movie. And it's probably maybe the best monster movie. It's just because it's so primal and interesting, and all the kind of mythological things to sort of echo out from the central idea that it's a monster movie. It's stowed away on this ship. He's picking off the crew one by one. Will they live? And it's Stanley Banner's B movie. That's what its core principles are.
Yeah.
And you bring an artist like Scott on board and great things happen. And in a way, Prometheus sort of worked in the opposite direction. It starts off too complicated and never found its purity, and it just became more rambly. And then Alien Covenant was a bad reaction to Prometheus. He'd never got these ideas under control. He became fascinated with David more than he was with the alien. That became an afterthought. So it's neither one thing or the other. And there are, again, visually, both films have wonderful things in them, but they don't satisfy. I don't know why. I mean, this prequel element sort of obsessed him.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a sort of sense of ownership or something. He wants to sort of bring it back and reclaim it. And I guess he felt if he was going to do another sequel, he would have to in some way recognize aliens and recognize...
Which he never did.
No, absolutely not.
It's funny. I went on the set of Alien Covenant, and it's fantastic. And it's the only actually Ridley Scott set I've been on. And so that was a privilege, and talking to him and doing the whole thing with the guided tour, and you end up in the creature shop, which is brilliant because you get to prod the aliens and do all the things that you want to do. Oh, it's clammy.
Take some photographs, I hope.
Well, you can't. No, it's one thing you can't do.
God damn it.
You can't bring out your camera. They're all like, no. But they were funny guys, and they, and I was chatting to the creature makers and talking to the whole thing about their love of Giga and how they watched the first film. And of course, I written the book by then, and some of them had read my book, which is also a wonderful thing. I actually saw copies on the set. That if anything does for your ego, well, it was that. You're like, oh, my book's being used as a tool for Alien Covenant. But I was talking to them about aliens. I said, well, has anyone talked about the Queen and how that works? And they all kind of look at each other going, don't mention the Queen in front of Ridley. Don't do that. No.
That's brilliant.
We just, that's some weird aberration. That, I think they kind of, in their own heads, they said, well, look, it kind of evolved, from this science in Alien Covenant, just something evolved into James Cameron's part of the world. And actually, you get the real difference between Ridley Scott and James Cameron in the ideas, in the sense that Scott wants something more impressionistic and more unconscious and fairy tale like, don't be too precise. Cameron, the hard, logic man, wants to explain the biology. He studied marine biology and physics and all those things. And the engineer in him says, where are the eggs from? Something's giving us eggs. Where do they come from? And so he works it all out, and scientifically it works. And that satisfies, I think, people a lot more sometimes than Ridley's more elusive, anything goes kind of principle at the edges of his film.
Right. What was it like seeing Ridley sort of directing? What was your impression of him on set?
That was fantastic. That's kind of a little bit where you get it. I watched it. It was kind of, I think the scene didn't finally make it in. It's sort of an extension of a scene where David and Billy Crudup's character, Orem, I think he's called, are walking along a corridor. A classic alien corridor, dripping water, one pale bulb of a light, very atmospheric, and they're just sort of walking along, having this kind of rather sinister conversation about creation, God versus man, all those things that are in the film. And it's just one slice of that. And Ridley was directing via PA. So he's talking to a microphone and conducting the whole thing. And they walk on, do the first scene, and you can see it wasn't quite right. Although I couldn't figure out exactly what it was. I'm standing at a monitor. I'm not right there in front of it, pointing at things. I'm looking at the monitor, going, well, it doesn't quite fit. And Ridley stops, and there's a pause, and you hear Ridley's voice come through, going, "Okay, Michael, And Michael Wilson's character is David, like stiff. And he says, just step 2 paces to your left. Fassbender does exactly what he's told. It goes boom, boom, boom. There's another pause. And you see the frame just take shape. There's a couple of other things he adjusted. And it really was, and it's a cliche, the painter with his palette and his easel, looking back and going, the proportions are wrong. And it just took a tiny adjustment. And there was this balance in the shot. And I thought, this is what Ridley does, isn't it? He sees things. He sees the frame. I think other directors may have mapped all that out with storyboards and figured it out and got it wrong, maybe, a lot of them, because they don't have that immediate ability to look and go, that isn't quite right. And he pulled that frame exactly into perfection, in a way, the balancing elements of it, and carried on. It was a very small part of the film, but you saw how he did it and what he was doing.
It reminds me of a comment once Stephen Sondheim made when he was saying at a certain point in his career, he realized he couldn't write a bad song. He'd mastered his craft to the point that not every song he'll write will be great, but he would never write a bad song again.
Yeah.
He just knew, and I feel that Ridley Scott did that quite early in his career. And although there are films that I sort of worry about, and as I say, they don't exactly work, none of them are sort of, even Prometheus, which I think is very disappointing in comparison to Alien, is still, there's a hell of a lot there to enjoy. There's a hell of a lot there to savor. And that's my feeling with Ridley Scott. Well, I mean, there are several directors who are that he'll never really make a truly awful film. He might not make a film to your taste or that you won't enjoy or whatever, but it'll always be a level of competence that's really a very high level.
Oh, absolutely. He says it. He says it not with ego. He says it almost as a practical thing. He says, I've got an eye and I know how it will look. I can make it look. I've got the eye. And that's true. And in fact, he probably has the best eye in the business at the moment. You can argue again about his narrative choices and some of the scripts and where he's gone with things. But that eye is astonishing and unbeatable. I mean, the 2 trailers we got this autumn just showed you that again. The Last Duel, it looks like Kingdom of Heaven. It has that kind of austere but yet grand quality of medieval world brought to life. Then Gucci has a kind of richness. And he always says, one of his subgenres, I think, and people don't talk about it very much, is he comes from a humble working class background, north of England, Ridley Scott, and it's very much his character. He has that, we don't show off quality to him, a very pragmatic kind of man, despite being this great artist. And I think he's fascinated by wealth and the kind of curdling quality of wealth. It crops up again and again in his films, these mansions and houses, and Gucci, I think, is very much part of that. He's sort of fascinated by class systems within worlds, and Alien has a class system built onto above decks and below decks. Blade Runner has these kind of penthouses where the rich live, and then this kind of bottom level where life carries on, just about survives. A lot of that comes from Metropolis, but he is interested and fascinated by class, Ridley Scott, which I think has to do with his background a bit, and to do with the fact that he was transported from London sort of to Hollywood, and it was greatly successful. Suddenly went to these kind of living in these great palatial homes in LA, and obviously liking it and having a taste for it, but endlessly questioning it in his films. Someone to Watch Over Me is about wealth. Black Rain has elements of that, the tier systems in Japan. And he's constantly revisiting that theme throughout his work. He has a social side to his directing. We always think of him genre and look and blockbustering, all those kind of things. But actually, I think he's quite a socially orientated director.
Yeah, he seems, even in his history films, Robin Hood and again, which didn't work completely. Actually, that's a question I did want to ask was, how do you're writing a monograph, like a retrospective on Ridley Scott, and you've done them on Wes Anderson, and you've done them, and we're definitely going to have another podcast episode to cover the other books, because I don't want to shortchange any of them, really. But as you say, your relationship with these directors might well be very supportive to one degree, but there are films that just don't work for you. How do you deal with that in terms of when you're putting the book together?
It's a tricky thing, and it's a balancing act. It was something, going back to Empire, that I had a very good editor early on, a guy called Phil Thomas, and he said Empire needs to be inclusive, not exclusive, and he never liked negatives on the cover. You don't, the worst, put this, or why this went wrong, kind of cover. So what we're doing is we're inviting people to come in to something and you're getting people into the cinema. You're not pushing them out of it. Of course, you've got to tell them when films are bad, but the ethos is positive. And that was quite unusual. I think it remains quite unusual in film coverage. To this day, a lot of websites are all about why things have gone wrong and what's going, I hate this, why, Candyman is good, why Candyman is bad, all these kind of elements. And we were very much about, we're all in this together. We love movies. Let's hope this is as good as it can be. Every day we used to say in Empire was Christmas Eve, because everything had the potential to be marvelous until you kind of saw it, and that was where we lived. We lived in Christmas Eve on Empire. We were the greatest preview magazine that ever existed.
It's like the bit rushing to the cinema to see the trailers. You can't miss the trailers.
Yeah.
I want to watch the trailers.
Oh, God, we were absolutely that. And we had the element of, you go, after you'd seen the film, we were the guys in the pub with you afterwards going, well, yeah, but that and this, and having those conversations. But I took that with me into books almost by instinct. The element of you've got to be positive, but you've got to be honest as well. And things like Prometheus were kind of interesting because there was a texture to write about that. But when you come to things like Exodus, which I don't like as very much as a movie, I think the plague sequence is Ridley just virtuoso, but elsewhere, it just felt heavy and cumbersome, that film. And so you just have to kind of balance that. I mean, who wants to buy a book in which you tell them films are terrible? There's a kind of a pragmatic publishing element. But thankfully, you've got your backbone of Alien, Blade Runner, Gladiator, to be there for you to bring people in, and then you can tell about Legend of the Duelist and all the other great ones. But you have to kind of confront the jacks. We talked about Coppola earlier on. What you can talk about The Godfather and Apocalypse Now in the conversation, and you're kind of laughing. But what happens when you get to Jack? And with Coppola, it was slightly different because it's a bit more about his life as much as it was about the films and the marriage of those two things. So you could talk about Jack in relation to his dead son and the fact that he was trying to find a path in Hollywood that was successful again. He was trying to understand Hollywood again, and the whole Robin Williams thing was very big at the time. And I think he was just contrarian as well. I think he liked the idea of doing the polar opposite to Apocalypse Now and shocking people by doing that and paying off debts. There's a long and complicated story to Coppola's choices. And I think you try and make sense of that in terms of the bad films. But I think there is a point, and I'm sure other writers have said so to you. You just got to call a spade and go, this film doesn't work, and try and figure out why that is as much as you can. I'm doing Cameron at the moment, and I've hit upon True Lies, and I think True Lies has got fantastic stuff in it. His orchestration of action sequences still, to my mind, peerless. He just can throw metal around like no one else can. But there's a tone in that film that, as much as I want to like it, I don't. It's just rather sour, and it's an attempt at humor and all those things. Having real trouble trying to get that on page, without just going, I hate this film and I don't like it. And I don't hate it, but it's difficult. And in fact, in some ways, the hardest films to write about are the ones that haven't gone well, and make sense of that. But and there are people like David Thompson, who just thrive on writing about films they don't like and saying what's wrong and picking it apart. And I have great admiration for that skill of going in and going, well, this doesn't work at all, and being absolutely emphatic about it. I always love that comment of Thompson's about Harrison Ford and Blade Runner, and just saying, well, I would give up all 3 Indiana Jones films, as it was at the time, for 30, for half an hour of Blade Runner. He said, I would give them up if I can keep half an hour of Blade Runner. And just a part of me understands that. I love Indiana Jones, don't get me wrong. And I joyously experienced watching those films, growing up with them, and would watch them this afternoon very easily. But I get that thing with David Thompson, and I greatly admire that skill to nail it. I think he said something like that criticism can be like the song of the blackbirds in film writing. It's another modern thing, is that we get caught cheerleading a little bit, and a lot of that's to do with the hype machine being first and all those things that go on now with the internet and the way films are covered. But it's I get it. Sometimes great criticism is very valid.
I think there has to be one of my real, because I'm generally speaking quite an enthusiast. I don't protect my 5 stars as if they're a rare currency that lose value if spent. I'll throw them around with gay abandon when when I feel it's merited. But having said that, I do think in terms of fandoms, there is a tendency to confuse something being good and having genuine quality, which I think you can argue about as if it is objective, not necessarily because it is objective, but as if it is. You can sort of talk about, look, well, it doesn't follow the rules of the genre, or it does this or it does that, and it doesn't do it in an interesting way. You can, the blocking of the scene is just wrong. You can look at stuff like, I mean, I look at Terrence Malick films and just the more recent ones and just think, it's fucking no blocking in this movie. Everybody's wandering around, they don't know where to stand, and it doesn't have the intended effect as far as I can tell. So there's a difference between that. Is it good, and do I enjoy it? There's loads of stuff that I enjoy that's absolute shit, or from a sort of quality that, I mean, I think there are very few James Bond movies that really stand up as movies, but I enjoy them. Especially the Roger Moore years. They're not even films. They're just not even. They don't obey. They kind of and people. I was having an argument on the internet a few years ago with somebody who was talking about guilty pleasures. There's no such thing as guilty pleasures. If you enjoy it, you shouldn't feel guilty. And I was like, yeah, you should. You should. There are some guilty pleasures. There are some times that it feels good. I mean, I love eating McDonald's every now and again, but I know it's not good for me, and I should be. And my awareness of that is part of the reason I enjoy it now and again. So that's sort of like, I think there should really be an ability to distinguish between those two things. The pleasure that comes with just watching, I love watching kung fu movies, but there comes a certain point where you're just thinking, this, as a movie, this is awful, but as a kung fu movie, this is great.
Yeah, we used to have endless arguments in Empire, which I won for a while. We used to have something called Classic Back, which was basically a writer gets to revisit a classic and do an essay on it for Empire, and do a lovely big picture to go with it. And it really was as I saw it was the canon. Empire does the canon. You do Citizen Kane, you do Raging Bull, you do All About Eve. You do the films that people should have seen and open them up in an Empire way. So it wasn't too kind of academic and fusty and all those things. And we have people like Chris Hewitt, who's a marvelous writer and an enthusiast, but maybe comes at things slightly more modern, would go, I want to do Evil Dead 2. And I would go, no. Every time it used to happen on a monthly basis, this argument. You go, what are we going to do for a classic this time? And he would go, Evil Dead 2. And I would go, no, it's not a classic. You've got to understand what the canon is in relation to what your passions are. And I'm not doing down Evil Dead 2. It's a film I really greatly enjoy, and it's got wonderful, tricky things in it. But there's a certain thing that what the canon is. And I kept encouraging him to go and write about something maybe he was uncertain about, a Hitchcock film or something. Go and do Vertigo. And he would be, and worry about that. But I wanted to make that distinction. You can have that relativist argument and just fall down the old black hole and go, Mozart's as good as Bananarama, we're all going to be relativists about this. But you've got to have a canon, because it gives you something to write about and gives you a kind of foundation. And it's, you've got to know why The Godfather is The Godfather and other films aren't The Godfather. And that is at the fundament of good film criticism to be about, knowing the textures and finding them out and getting into them and appreciating them and then enjoying them and sort of loving that distinction and sort of emphasizing it.
Then subverting it, then kicking against it, then arguing, for the inclusion of stuff that hasn't previously been considered, but arguing in such a way that let's consider Evil Dead 2, or let's consider something, but we're doing it on the basis, on the criteria of where is it pushing the art forward, rather than did I like it a lot. I mean, I love Elf. I'll watch that movie any day of the week. But I wouldn't necessarily, hold it up as some sort of like innovative. It's just a very enjoyable film.
Yeah, absolutely. And you go back and go, well, where does Capra begin and Elf end, and where does Elf begin and Capra end? You say these distinctions. Capra was a populist filmmaker who made films for massive audiences who wanted to be cheered up. And that's what Elf is. It's a film to cheer people up, and it's a fish out of water comedy and all those kind of things it does very well. And you're absolutely right. Those things are, the best thing about rules is breaking them and finding reasons why the canon, what enters the canon and why it should now enter it. But I always think if you have that backbone to work from, then all these things can sort of come into focus. You can compare. You go back to Ridley, so you have Alien and Blade Runner, and you can then go, well, how does Prometheus relate to it, and look to it, and you can find the good. You can sort of from that and go, well, some are, I quite like Tetro, the late Coppola film. It's a bit all over the place, but it's got wonderful, very personal things in it, which is what Coppola's so good at. The richness of family life. I don't think there's a director like him on that. And Tetro sort of revisits that. And, it's a bit unsung. And doing the Coppola book, it was great to go to look at small Coppola and sort of discover that the artist is still there. Yeah, maybe he's a bit more ragged and, less disciplined. He's always been a bit ragged and undisciplined in how he goes about things. I think Christ, he made the Apocalypse Now.
I think you're right. I think the canon exists anyway, whether you want it or not, because if it doesn't exist in terms of you talking about it on the pages of Empire, or it exists in terms of your publishers saying, oh, these books won't sell. We need to do this, this, and this. It exists in terms of syllabi in universities. This is going to be these are the films that we're going to look at, because nobody, and it exists in terms of the films that you'll watch during your life, because you won't watch everything. So you have to, it's nice to know the Sight and Sound top 250 movies ever made, just as or the IMDb most popular movies if you want to watch Shawshank Redemption again. It's nice to know that those things exist, so you can sort of navigate and build your own canon, because that's in the end, that's what we end up doing.
You're right. The Beatles are the Beatles because they're the Beatles. And they're unshakable. And in some ways it's boring, but it's true. Charlie Watts died this week, and I've just been reading. I tried to be a drummer at one time in my life, so I was very kind of, I knew about Charlie Watts, and it's very sad. But I love reading all the drummers on Charlie Watts and talking about why he was so important. And it was drummers reinforcing a drumming canon. That's what I loved about it. Charlie Watts is, one of the most important drummers of all time. And they were sort of saying why. It's a great piece by Stuart Copeland, The Police, talking about, he goes, I'm going to get technical now, people. And starts talking about the way he played rhythms. And he softened his snare drum and emphasized the bass drum. And he said this gave it both sort of an imperative and something relaxed at the same time. And he says that is the Rolling Stones music, driving forward, yet somehow it's relaxed. This is all comes from Charlie Watts's beat. I thought, what a fantastic sentence. That's completely opened up my thinking about the Rolling Stones, how important Charlie Watts was. And that to me is, what you're meant to be doing as a great writer, or that's what I'm trying to do as a writer, is you're trying to tell them things that just open up these worlds. It comes back to my old editor, you're trying to get people to watch films, not the opposite. We're going, actually, although they're a bit archaic and maybe old-fashioned, you go back to some of the great film noirs of the 40s and 50s, and these are the things that you look in them and just think how putting two people in a frame like this saves you time on set. You can do dialogue and have deep focus and all these there were technical things at the time, and just picking them out and showing them to people. My favorite film books open up the worlds of films I know and love and reinvent them for me. So that's when I came to do Alien and Blade Runner, I had trepidation because they're so well known and they're so written about. What do you say and new? How can you bring something that's so celebrated? But I had to kind of brush all that aside and go, right, well, give my own feelings for it and try and open it up and try to get people back to it. If you're just telling them something they love, they'll love you for it. We're sitting here having a conversation about films because we love doing it. We could have a conversation about the Rolling Stones if you wanted, and just go, that one and that one. This is part of how human beings sort of live. They share their favorite things.
Talking about canons, talking about getting people to into the cinema, getting people to read books. That's what we're all about. So you've got a recommendation for your favorite film, or not your favorite film book? Sorry, it's just a film book recommendation. Does it have to be favorite or the?
Favorite's always hard for me because I'll mention two, if I may. One is this. If you can see that,
The Conversation by Michael Ondaatje.
Yeah, this is quite an unusual book in the sense that it's an interview by a novelist with an editor. But Walter Murch is an astonishing person. He basically made sense of Apocalypse Now. He was Coppola's editor and sound editor, and he's largely responsible for the beauty of Godfather Part 2 and those incredible transitions. A lot of that is Walter Murch. And he's the guy who got all the footage from Apocalypse Now when Coppola was basically going through a nervous breakdown and, was locking himself away in his San Francisco office, refusing to come out. And it was Murch who this film fell back on. And Murch found a way through Apocalypse Now. He said, he woke Coppola up at one point and said, we've got to have a voiceover. We've got to have these things. And a path was found. And out of it emerged, one of the most significant films in the medium. But he's also, he's a wonderful intellectual. He's a very unusual man in terms of the world of film, because he intellectualizes naturally and is unashamed about it. So he will go down philosophical paths and technical paths and talk about art and talk about all sorts of different things and really, bring the world of film to light. And it's a technical book. If you're going into filmmaking, I would say read this first, because he talks about editing like no one else I've known, about the idea of following, like literally a spot within a frame. And the next frame you jump to, you're still following that. So you don't, you start to realize what bad editing is that they don't have this kind of flow, this idea of where narrative exists within a frame. Where are you concentrating at any one time? And Ondaatje is a great guy. I mean, they made The English Patient together with Antti Minghella. Ondaatje was the novel, and he was heavily involved in the film, and Murch was the editor. And so they talk about The English Patient a lot, but it's got incredible stories about The Godfather, incredible stories about Apocalypse Now, incredible stories about Return to Oz, which is Walter Murch's only film as a director, in which he had a very bad time. It's quite an interesting film. It's a very dark film, and it's very good on that. And there's lovely little pieces from people like George Lucas and Coppola himself about Murch is brilliant. I think it's just as a way of opening up the frame for you. You've got an incredible guide in Walter Murch, and he's an unusual guide. He's a guy who edits. So he watches more footage than anyone else. He sees endless takes and he looks at it. And so he's right at the very root of the film narrative and has to kind of turn chaos into story. And you really appreciate that process in film. It's called City of Nets by Otto Friedrich. And this is a history of Hollywood in the 1940s. Now, this book was the inspiration for Barton Fink. This was the key book that the Coen Brothers read to pull out Barton Fink from. And he's a terrific writer. He died in the 1980s, Otto Friedrich. And it's a story of Hollywood and done in this incredible, sort of vivid, fast-paced journalistic way. He used to be a newspaper editor, has a great speed he delivers stories. And really, it's a story of America in the 1940s, the changing country coming out of the Depression, the Second World War, and then, the political scene from there. And he talks about gangsters, and he's a great gossip, but the backbone is just this incredible, vivid, the life of Hollywood during the 1940s, when it was this most Hollywood, if you want, the kind of golden era times, Orson Welles, all the kind of John Huston, Hawks, all the great characters of that world. I was greatly inspired by his methodology. I was greatly inspired by his ability to condense huge productions into 2 paragraphs, and you kind of get it. He gets the essence of things. And that's a great talent to have. In writing books, as I was saying earlier on, you've got to take all of Apocalypse Now and put it into a chapter. And this is a story that's still getting bigger and bigger. It's untamable. And I had to turn to Otto Friedrich, who's writing about a completely different world, and look to him and go, yes, that's kind of what you do. You chart around certain things, anecdotes. I always realized that there's always a great danger in film books in making them too listy or making them too chronological, ticking things off a list. There are very good books written like that, encyclopedic style. But to me, and this is sort of my journalistic training, the anecdote, the human story is the most beautiful constituent part of any film book. You put them there, the reader. Humans relate to other humans. They're not going to relate to too much technical stuff or too much detail or too many lists and this happened and this happened, which are great traps you can fall into. Stop and do one good anecdote.
We did a review of Quentin Tarantino's novelization of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and that novel is just anecdote after anecdote. And all of them, you can tell, have some basis in some real figure or some real event. Tarantino was an artist of the anecdote. You just to break down his scripts, just people talking about other people in anecdotal form. And that's how, again, it's a human way of interacting. It's telling stories, and that's what you're trying to do. So you try,
Other people tell me whether I succeed or not, but you try and bring in that novelistic thing, which I think Otto Friedrich taught me, is that you start a story with an anecdote is much better than starting on, March the 7th, 1942, X movie, directed Y, and which is fine. You'll bring that stuff into it. But if you start with, it was the day her makeup went wrong on set and she screamed her head off, and you start with something, Friedrich's also written a wonderful book about Berlin and Berlin in the 1920s into the 1930s. Fabulous book about German Expressionism and Bauhaus and Brecht, and incredible time in Berlin. And there's a bit where he talks about Marlene Dietrich's audition with von Sternberg for The Blue Angel. And it's just magisterial film writing. It's just, how haughty she was, how terrifying she was. And Sternberg making her walk up and down. And Jannings, the star, just wants nothing to do with her. Who is this? No mark, But Sternberg can see the greatest star in the world coming into being. You can just see it. And it's just, I thought, God, that's what you want to get at. You want to get at that. Again, he does it in about a page. You achieve, the story of Marlene Dietrich and how she came to be. It's just,
immediately you want to go and watch Blue Angel as well.
Absolutely. And you get everything. And also you get, which I think is a really great quality, that idea of what's going on around them in the universe that's leaning in. So City of Nets is a great story about LA and the LA of that time and what's going on, and the rise of communism, and and HUAC is just around the corner. So those two forces. In fact, it sort of starts with the end of the Depression and sort of ends as HUAC comes in. So there's a kind of sense of doom written into it, which is also written into his great book about Berlin, which sort of starts with Caligari and Murnau and the end of the First World War, and ends with the Nazis. It ends with Goebbels and Hitler. And it's like a ticking bomb story. It's coming. And you're just kind of reading it thinking, oh shit, just around the corner. They're just going to blow all this apart. And that dynamic is wonderful.
God damn it, Ian. God damn it. That's another 2 books I've got to read. Another 2 books this podcast is costing me a fortune.
I bet it is. Everyone go, you got to read this.
I know, and they're all such compelling. I mean, that sounds brilliant. Those 2, I know Michael Ondaatje because I've read all of his novels, I think.
Yeah.
I loved his Billy the Kid. If you have the opportunity to read his Billy the Kid book, which is kind of like a novel, a mix between novel and poetry, really. It's really, really good. But yeah, those are 2 great book recommendations. I'm definitely putting them on my list. Thanks so much for talking to me, Ian. It's been an absolute pleasure. And if you're willing, I will definitely have you back, and
definitely.
We can talk about Coppola, and we can talk about some other books as and when, and Cameron,
Yes, Cameron's going to be, I'm writing it now, I'm wrestling with it now, and that's due next autumn. It's kind of the weird, glacial time things you work on with books.
I've just recorded my Christmas #1 single just now, and in the heat of an Italian summer. But thanks so much, Ian. I really appreciate it.
Cheers. All right. Cheers, mate.
So that was our conversation. As you can tell, we talked about loads of stuff. It was a really interesting deep dive into Ridley Scott, and to hear someone who's been on the set and interviewed Sir Ridley Scott extensively. By the way, since I recorded that episode, I got an opportunity to watch The Last Duel, which I thought was stunning. I thought it was one of Ridley Scott's best films in recent years. I would go so far as to say it's maybe his best since Gladiator, maybe even his best since Thelma and Louise. The recommended books Ian gave us, both of which I've now bought, you'll be glad to know. Michael Ondaatje's The Conversation with Walter Murch, and Otto Friedrich's City of Nets. And I've already started The Conversation, and it's as interesting, fascinating as you can imagine. Thanks go to Elliot Atkins for the music, as ever, and to Ali Harwood for supplying the artwork. Until the next episode, please take care.
If there's one thing that my family and friends know me for, it's being an amazing gift giver. I owe it all to Celebrations Passport from 1-800-Flowers.com, my one-stop shopping site that has amazing gifts for every occasion. With Celebrations Passport, I get free shipping on thousands of amazing gifts. And the more gifts I give, the more perks and rewards I earn. To learn more and take your gift giving to the next level, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.